The hiss of the steam engine was a long, mournful sigh, a sound that seemed to be surrendering to the vast, unpitying Wyoming sky. When the train shuddered to its final stop, the noise gave way to the sharp, whipping cry of the wind. It was a wind born in the high, lonely peaks of the Bighorn Mountains, and it carried with it the scent of pine, ice, and an immense, crushing solitude. June Calder descended from the carriage, her boots meeting the frozen earth with a dull thud. She clutched the collar of her thin woolen coat, a garment that felt more like a memory of warmth than a shield against the biting cold. Her movements were deliberate, measured, as if she were afraid the ground might not hold her. She kept her head bowed, her worn bonnet hiding her face, but it could not hide the tension in her shoulders or the way she held her breath, as if waiting for a blow. She was young, with hair the color of damp soil and eyes the gray of a winter storm gathering over the plains. But the youth in her face was overshadowed by a stillness, a profound weariness that had settled deep in her bones. She carried a single, scuffed leather satchel that held everything she owned in the world, and in her mind, she carried a memory, sharp and cold as a shard of glass, of a night that had redefined her. It was the memory of her first night. The phrase itself was a lie. There had been no tenderness, no shared intimacy, nothing of the whispered secrets she had read about in cheap, tattered novels. There had only been a transaction. She remembered the man. Older, with a soft paunch and eyes that assessed her the way a rancher might assess livestock. He had not taken her with passion, but with a quiet, methodical sense of ownership, as if he were collecting on a debt. Her father, a man broken by drink and failed ventures, had orchestrated the arrangement to settle his accounts. The memory wasn't of the act itself, her mind had mercifully blurred those edges, but of the moments after. The rustle of coins on the bedside table, the man's thin, satisfied smile in the dim lamplight, the suffocating feeling of being an object, a piece of property that had been used and was now, officially, paid for. That night had branded her with a silent, searing shame. It was a constant whisper in her ear, asterisk, "You are not worthy. You have been spent." It made her flinch from a kind word and recoil from a casual touch. Love, she had decided, was a luxury for girls who were whole, for girls who had not been bartered. The wind tore at her coat, snapping her back to the present. Bridle Pass, Wyoming. It wasn't much of a town, more of a toehold against the wilderness. A dozen or so raw timber buildings huddled together along a single muddy street, the ruts frozen into jagged scars. The station master, a stout man with a beard full of frost, gave her a passing glance, his eyes lingering for a moment before moving on. In that brief look, June felt the old, familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She instinctively pulled her coat tighter, making herself smaller, less visible. To be seen was to be judged. She pulled a folded, creased letter from the pocket of her dress. The paper was soft from being handled so many times. It was her only compass, her only reason for being here in this desolate place. It was from a woman named Mabel Clay. The handwriting was stark and black, with no frills or flourishes. Asterisk, looking for a girl. Strong back, quiet tongue. Help needed at the winter way station. Cooking, cleaning, mending harnesses for the sleigh teams. Room and board provided. No room for sentiment. If your hands can work, you'll have a place. The letter had been passed to her by a traveling preacher who knew of her situation. A girl with no family left and even fewer prospects. The words were as harsh as the Wyoming wind, but they were also a lifeline. Asterisk, if your hands can work. That she could do. She could work until her muscles screamed and her fingers were raw. Work was honest. Work was a way to make her body so tired that her mind would have no energy left to torment her. Work didn't ask about her past or look into her eyes to see the ghosts that lived there. She approached the station master, keeping her gaze fixed on the muddy tip of his boots. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, easily snatched away by the wind. He grunted, not unkindly. "What can I do for you, miss?" "I'm looking for the way station, Mrs. Mabel Clay's place." He squinted, his gaze traveling from her worn boots to the cheap fabric of her coat. It was another assessment, but this one was different. He wasn't weighing her value as a woman. He was gauging her chances of survival. "Mabel's place is a good mile out of town, north, past the blacksmith's. You followed the sleigh tracks? Can't miss it. It's the last building before the woods swallow the road whole." He paused, then added, "It's a hard place for a winter." "I'm not afraid of work," June said, the words coming out with more conviction than she felt. The man nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth she herself was unsure of. "Well, Mabel Clay ain't afraid of much of anything. You'll learn that soon enough." She thanked him and turned, her satchel bumping against her leg. The walk through Bridle Pass was an ordeal of the senses. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke from chimneys and the sharp, metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge from the saloon. A burst of rough laughter and the tinny notes of a piano spilled out onto the street, a sound of forced merriment that felt alien and jarring. Men in heavy coats and fur hats turned to watch her pass, their gazes curious, appraising. She felt their eyes on her back like a physical weight. Each look was a potential question. Each question a doorway back to the shame she was so desperate to outrun. She walked faster, her eyes on the road ahead. The town thinned out quickly, the buildings growing sparser until there was only the blacksmith's shop. Its rhythmic asterisk clang, 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 asterisk a steady, lonely heartbeat in the frozen air. Beyond it, the road became little more than two deep ruts carved by sleigh runners in the packed snow. The wilderness pressed in on either side, a silent, watching army of pine and bare aspen trees. The sun was a weak, pale disk in the sky, offering little light and no warmth at all. This was it, the edge of the world, a place where a person could disappear. For the first time since stepping off the train, a flicker of something that wasn't fear or shame stirred within her. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was the possibility of anonymity. Here, perhaps, she could be just a pair of working hands. She could be June Calder, the girl who mended harnesses. Not June Calder, the girl whose father had sold her first night for the price of a gambling debt. Finally, she saw it. Set back from the road, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, was a long, low building made of dark, weathered logs chinked with mud. A plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the darkening sky. A large barn stood beside it, and a series of corrals, currently empty, stretched out behind. This was Mabel Clay's way station, the last outpost of civilization before the vast, untamed north. It looked sturdy, unadorned, and utterly indifferent to the world. As she approached the porch, the memory of that other room, the one with the floral wallpaper and the heavy velvet curtains, rose in her mind. She could almost smell the stale cigar smoke and cheap perfume. Her hand tightened on the handle of her satchel, her knuckles white. She had come all this way, hundreds of miles by rattling train, to escape that room. But she knew, with a certainty that made her feel sick, that the room was not a place, it was a part of her now, a locked chamber inside her own heart. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the icy air, the cold searing her lungs. Then she walked up the 3 wooden steps and knocked on the heavy oak door. The sound was flat and final in the immense silence. She had arrived. She was here, in the cold, with a secret she would never tell, praying that this place was far enough away to build a new life, or at least to forget the one that had been broken. The knock was answered not by a voice, but by the groan of a heavy bolt being drawn back. The door opened just enough to reveal a sliver of the woman within. She was tall and gaunt, her body as unyielding as the winter-hardened timber of the house. Her face was a roadmap of harsh seasons and private sorrows, with lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth. Her hair, the color of iron and ash, was pulled back in a severe bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were not cruel, but they were utterly devoid of softness. They took in June from head to toe in a single, sweeping glance that missed nothing. "You're the girl from the letter," the woman stated. It was not a question. June nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She clutched the handle of her satchel. "I am June Calder." The woman, Mabel Clay, gave a curt nod in return. She opened the door wider, a silent command to enter. The room inside was spare and overwhelmingly practical. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot of something thick and savory bubbling over a low flame. A long plank table, scrubbed nearly white from years of use, was flanked by two simple benches. The air smelled of wood smoke, stewing meat, and strong lye soap. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a place built for function, not comfort. Mabel pointed a long, bony finger toward a stack of firewood near the hearth. "The box is low. Fill it. Then you can take your things to your room." There was no offer to help with her bag, no invitation to warm herself by the fire. It was a test, immediate and clear. June set her satchel down without a word, pulled off her thin gloves, and went back out into the biting wind. She made 4 trips to the woodpile, her arms aching, her fingers growing numb with the cold. She stacked the split logs neatly in the box, making sure the pile was level and tight. When she was finished, she stood, brushing splinters from her coat, and waited. Mabel inspected the work with a critical eye, even nudging one of the logs with the toe of her boot. Finally, she gave another one of her short, decisive nods. "The room is out back, through the stable. There's a door at the far end. A cot and a blanket are inside. Supper is in 1 hour. Don't be late." With that, she turned back to her stew. The dismissal absolute. June was left standing in the middle of the room, feeling less like a guest and more like a tool that had just been put away. She picked up her satchel and headed for the door Mabel had indicated. The stable was warmer than the outside, the air thick with the sweet, earthy smell of hay and the comforting scent of horses. 6 large sleigh horses stood in their stalls, their massive chests rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. They turned their heads as she passed, their dark, liquid eyes watching her with a placid curiosity that felt blessedly free of judgment. At the very end of the stable was a narrow wooden door. Her new home was not much larger than a horse stall. The walls were rough, unfinished logs, with moss and dried mud packed in the gaps to keep out the wind. A narrow cot with a single coarse wool blanket was pushed against the far wall. Beside it stood a small, 3-legged stool and an overturned crate that served as a table. A single, small window, high up on the wall, was covered with a piece of oiled parchment that allowed a dim, yellowed light to filter through. There was no fireplace, only the residual warmth that seeped through the wall from the stable. A few iron nails had been hammered into the logs to serve as hooks. June set her satchel on the cot. She ran a hand over the rough surface of the blanket. It was Spartan, lonely and cold, and it was the safest place she had ever been. There were no velvet curtains here, no floral wallpaper, no mirrors to force her to see the stranger who stared back at her with haunted gray eyes. Here, there was nothing to remind her of what she had been, only what she had to do. The silence was broken only by the soft shuffling of the horses, their occasional snorts and sighs a soothing, living presence on the other side of the wall. For the first time in months, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach loosen, just a fraction. Her life at the way station quickly fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and the rising and setting of the pale winter sun. She rose before dawn, the air in her small room so cold her breath plumed in front of her. Her first task was always the fire in the main house, coaxing life back into the embers. Then came the coffee, strong and black, which Mabel would drink while staring out the window, planning the day's labor. Their mornings were silent, a shared ritual of work that required no words. June learned the chores through observation and Mabel's sharp, minimal instructions. The horses get oats first, then water. Break the ice in the trough. Don't just crack it. Use the curved needle for the harness leather, the straight one for the blankets. The stew needs more salt. The praise was as spare as the instructions. A finished task that met Mabel's standards was rewarded not with a thank you, but with the absence of criticism. It was a language June quickly learned to understand. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. She learned to mend a broken trace with deft, sure movements, the waxed thread sliding through the thick leather. She learned the precise way to bank the fire at night so it would last until morning. She cooked simple, hearty meal stews, beans, and dense cornbread. Food meant to fuel a body for hard labor. She worked until her body ached with a clean, honest exhaustion that left no room for the ghosts of her past. At night, she would fall onto her cot and sleep a dreamless, deadened sleep, waking only when the first hint of gray light touched the parchment on her window. She did not smile, she did not sing or hum as she worked, and she never, ever looked at her own reflection. If she caught a glimpse of herself in the dark glass of a window pane at dusk, she would turn away quickly, a familiar cold dread washing over her. The girl in the reflection was a stranger, a vessel for a memory she was trying to bury. By refusing to look, she felt she could deny that girl's existence. Mabel, for her part, never asked a single question about where June had come from or why she had left. She seemed to have no curiosity about the world beyond her property line. Her focus was on the immediate, the tangible, the health of her horses, the supply of firewood, the impending threat of a snowstorm. One afternoon, as June was resoling a worn boot, she pricked her finger deeply with the awl. She gasped, dropping the tool as blood welled up, staining the pale leather. She expected a sharp reprimand from Mabel for her carelessness. The older woman came over, looked at the drop of blood on the boot, then at June's hand. She said nothing. She simply went to a small cupboard, came back with a tin of pine tar salve and a clean strip of cotton, and began to dress the wound with rough, efficient movements. "Hold still," was all she said. As she wrapped the cloth, her calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle. When she was done, she picked up the boot. "Let it be. The blood will dry. It's a work boot, not a church shoe. Finish it when the bleeding stops." June stared at her, stunned. There was no anger, no lecture, just a practical solution to a practical problem. In that moment, June understood the nature of Mabel Clay's kindness. It was not a soft, comforting thing. It was hard and pragmatic, like the land itself. Mabel didn't care about June's pain, but she cared about having a worker with two functioning hands, and for June, who had been suffocated by the predatory sympathy of others. This stark, unfeeling practicality was a profound gift. It was a form of respect. Mabel respected her work, and that was all June dared to ask for. She kept to herself, a ghost moving through the daily chores. The way station was a stop for the sleigh mail and the occasional trapper or traveler heading north. When they came, seeking a hot meal and a place to rest their horses, June would serve them silently, her eyes downcast, retreating to the kitchen as soon as possible. She heard their talk of the world, of gold strikes and railroad disputes, but it all felt like a story from another lifetime. Her world had shrunk to the smell of hay and horsehide, the heat of the stove, the weight of an axe in her hands, and the quiet, profound emptiness of her small log room. It was a lonely existence, but it was an existence she controlled. Here, she was not an object to be appraised or used. She was simply a pair of hands, and in the vast, unforgiving silence of the Wyoming winter, that was enough. The winter deepened, sinking its teeth into the high country. For days, the sky was a sheet of bruised gray, and the wind had a patient, waiting quality. Then, one afternoon, The waiting ended. The first snowflakes drifted down, lazy and fat. But soon the wind rose to a shriek, and the world outside the way station dissolved into a churning, blinding whiteness. The blizzard was a living thing. It clawed at the log walls and threw itself against the door, rattling the latch. Inside, the world shrank to the warm, firelit circle of the main room. Mabel, unfazed, methodically checked their supplies of flour and salted pork, her movements as calm and predictable as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. June went about her chores, the howling of the storm a strangely comforting blanket. It sealed them in, cutting them off from the world. And for June, there was safety in that isolation. The storm was a wall, and on the other side of it were the towns, the people, and the memories she did not want. They were finishing a silent supper of bean soup and hard biscuits when a new sound cut through the gale. It was faint at first, then clearer, a man's shout, desperate and raw, followed by the terrified scream of a horse. Mabel was on her feet in an instant, her expression grim. "Get the lanterns." June's heart hammered against her ribs. She lit 2 oil lanterns, their steady glow a fragile defense against the roaring dark. Together, they braced themselves against the door, and with a great heave, forced it open against the wind and the piling snow. The night was a maelstrom of white. For a moment, they could see nothing but the furious swirl of snow in the lantern light. Then, a figure solidified out of the chaos. A man, tall and broad, his form almost monstrous under a thick layer of snow. He was leaning into the wind, his entire body a bulwark, holding the leads of 3 horses that were stumbling and wild-eyed with fear. "I need shelter," he yelled over the storm, his voice deep and strained. "My horses are hurt." "Bring them to the barn," Mabel shouted back, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the noise. "The main door is on the leeward side." The man nodded, his face a mask of snow and ice, and began the slow, torturous process of guiding the frightened animals around the house. June and Mabel fought the door closed, the wind trying to rip it from their grasp. "Stoke the fire in the barn stove," Mabel ordered, already pulling on a heavy sheepskin coat. "I'll get the medicine box." June ran to the barn, her boots sinking deep into the new drifts. Inside, the air was cold but still, a sanctuary from the storm's fury. The way station horses nickered softly in their stalls, disturbed by the commotion. With trembling hands, she lit the kindling in the small pot-bellied stove, adding logs until a welcome heat began to radiate outwards. Minutes later, the big barn door slid open with a groan, and the man led his horses inside. One was limping badly, favoring its right foreleg. Another had a long, dark gash across its flank, the blood frozen into stark, black crystals against its hide. The third seemed dazed, shivering uncontrollably. As the man brushed the snow from his hat and shoulders, June got her first proper look at him. He was tall, with a frame built for hard work, wide in the shoulders and narrow in the hips. His face, chiseled and weathered, was browned by a sun that seemed a distant memory in this endless winter. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of amber, flecked with gold, like the last rays of a summer sunset. They were calm, steady, and exhausted. "I'm Wyatt Hale," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't offer to shake hands, his attention already back on his animals. "Foreman for the Oxbow logging camp. North of here, an aspen came down in the wind, pinned us on the trail." Mabel appeared at June's side, carrying a wooden box filled with bottles, rags, and tins of salve. She gave Wyatt a quick, appraising look. "You're lucky you were this close. Another mile and the wolves would be tending your horses. Not us." She set the box down. "Let's see the damage." Wyatt ran a hand down the leg of the limping horse, his touch firm but gentle. "This is Bess. I think it's a bad sprain. Sam here." He gestured to the one with the gash, took the worst of it from a broken branch. June had been standing back, a silent observer. But at the sight of the animal's wound, something instinctual took over. She stepped forward, her shyness momentarily forgotten. He needs the wound cleaned before it can be stitched, and a hot poultice for the swelling on her leg. Both Mabel and Wyatt turned to look at her. It was the most she had said in one stretch since her arrival. Mabel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Wyatt's amber eyes rested on her, and for the first time, she felt a man's gaze that wasn't appraising or possessive. It was simply observant. "She knows horses," Mabel stated flatly, and that was all the permission June needed. She moved with a quiet, forgotten confidence. This was a world she understood. The clean, honest pain of an animal was something she could meet without fear. She fetched a bucket of warm water and clean cloths, speaking in a low, soothing murmur to the injured horse. The animal, a big roan, flinched as she approached the gash, its skin trembling. "Easy now, Sam," June whispered, reaching out not to the wound, but to his neck, stroking him gently. "Easy, boy." Wyatt watched, his posture still, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He watched as she expertly and gently cleaned the long cut, her movements efficient and sure. He watched as she examined the edges of the wound, determining its depth. He saw the way she anticipated the horse's fear, moving with its flinches, never forcing, only calming. Mabel prepared a needle and gut, but June shook her head slightly. "The skin is torn too wide. Stitching will just pull it apart when he moves. It's better to pack it with salve and bind it tight. It will leave a bigger scar, but it will heal cleaner." Wyatt didn't question her. He didn't look to Mabel for confirmation. He looked at June, at the competence in her hands and the focus in her eyes, and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He held the lantern for her as she worked, spreading a thick, pungent salve into the wound and then applying a pressure bandage made of clean cotton. Her hands were steady. The horse, seeming to sense her confidence, grew calmer, leaning into her touch. Next, she turned to Bess, the mare with the sprained leg. She prepared a poultice of bran and herbs, the warm, steaming mixture wrapped in a cloth. As she knelt in the hay to bind the poultice to the mare's swollen fetlock, she was acutely aware of Wyatt's presence beside her. He was silent, his breathing slow and even. He just watched. When she was finished, she stood up, brushing the hay from her dress. She felt tired but clean, the work having scoured the anxiety from her mind. She finally looked up at Wyatt Hale, expecting, she wasn't sure what, a word of thanks, perhaps. Or worse, the kind of patronizing praise that felt like a pat on the head, the kind that reminded her of her place. The man from her past had used praise as a weapon. Asterisk. "You're a quick learner." Asterisk, he would say, his smile never reaching his eyes. Asterisk, "You ought to be grateful I'm taking the time to teach you." Asterisk. Every compliment was an invoice, a reminder of the debt he believed she owed him. His approval was a cage. Wyatt Hale did not smile. He did not offer empty words. He simply looked at the clean bandages on his horses. Then his gaze met hers. He held it for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw no pity, no condescension, and no expectation. He saw her skill, and nothing more. He gave another slow, deliberate nod. It was a simple gesture, a silent acknowledgement from one capable person to another. It said, "Asterisk, I see your work. It is good." And then he turned away to get a blanket for his third horse. The gesture, in its profound simplicity, struck June like a physical blow. It was an affirmation without a price tag. It was respect, pure and unadorned. It asked for nothing in return, no smile, no thanks, no fawning gratitude. He had simply seen her, seen what she could do, and acknowledged it. She stood frozen in the warm, hay-scented air of the barn, the sound of the blizzard a distant roar. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she couldn't put a name to it. It was the first crack in the ice. A single, quiet nod from a stranger in a storm had done what months of silent, punishing labor could not. It had allowed a flicker of light into the dark, locked room of her heart. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world remade. The sky was a sharp, aching blue, and the snow lay in immense, sculpted drifts, sparkling under a sun that seemed to hold no memory of the storm. The wind was gone, and in its place was a profound, crystalline silence. Wyatt Hale and his horses stayed for 2 more days. The time was passed in the quiet rhythm of recovery. He helped Mabel clear a path to the woodpile, and June to mend a section of fence that had buckled under the snow's weight. He moved with an easy, unhurried strength, never speaking unless necessary. Yet his presence filled the space in a way that was solid and reassuring, not intrusive. When he worked alongside June in the barn, checking the bandages on his horses, he would sometimes catch her eye, and the same quiet acknowledgement would pass between them. It was a language without words, a shared understanding of competence and care. On the 3rd morning, he deemed his animals fit to travel the now passable trails back to the logging camp. He settled his debt with Mabel not with coin, which he knew she'd refuse, but with a promise of a sled load of prime, seasoned firewood to be delivered the following week. To June, he said little. As he mounted his horse, he looked down at her where she stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "The roan's bandage will need changing in a few days," he said, his voice a low rumble in the cold air. "I know," she replied softly, her gaze on the horse. He held her gaze for a moment longer. "Much obliged, Miss Calder." He gave her that same simple nod he'd given her in the barn, a gesture that was becoming a language all its own. Then he turned his horse and rode away, his 2 other animals trailing behind, leaving 3 sets of tracks in the pristine snow. June watched until he was a small, dark figure against the vast white landscape. She had expected to feel a sense of relief when he left, a return to the safety of her solitude. Instead, a strange and unwelcome emptiness settled in the pit of her stomach. A week later, true to his word, one of Wyatt's loggers delivered a sled piled high with fragrant, split pine, and the week after that, Wyatt returned himself. He rode up not in a storm, but in the clear, cold light of late afternoon. June's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch when she saw him. He had a battered saddle slung over his shoulder. "The stitching's come loose on the cinch strap," he said to Mabel by way of greeting. Though his eyes found June where she was sweeping the porch, "Figured your girl had the better hand for it than any of my men." Mabel grunted, accepting the explanation and the offering he brought with him a string of fat, smoked trout wrapped in oilcloth. A hot meal was the unspoken other half of the bargain. While June took the saddle to the barn to work, Wyatt and Mabel sat at the long table, speaking in low tones about timber prices and the prospect of an early thaw. June worked on the saddle, her fingers moving with practiced skill. She could feel his presence, even from the house, when he later came into the barn to check on her progress. She kept her head bowed over her work, the scent of the leather and his proximity, a clean smell of pine and cold air making her feel strangely breathless. He didn't say anything, just watched for a minute before leaving her be. This became the pattern of the winter. Every week or 2, Wyatt Hale would find a reason to ride down from the Oxbow camp. He brought a fur coat with a torn lining, a bridle with a cracked cheek piece, a pair of worn-out work gloves that needed patching. He always brought a tribute, a bag of dark roasted coffee beans that filled the house with a rich, wonderful aroma, a slab of cured venison, once, a small jar of wild honey, thick and amber-colored like his eyes. He would sit at Mabel's table and drink coffee, and June would work on whatever repair he'd brought. Slowly, painfully, a thaw began inside of June that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. She started by speaking a single, hesitant sentence. As he unwrapped the trout one afternoon, she murmured, "They were smoked with hickory." Wyatt paused, looking at her with a flicker of surprise. "My camp cook's secret." A week later, She found the courage to ask a question. "Is the river still frozen solid up north?" "It is," he answered, his gaze direct and serious, as if she had asked him a question of great importance. "The ice is 4 feet thick. We're hauling logs across it until the thaw." He began to talk to her more, not with the empty pleasantries of strangers, but with small, offered details of his life. He told her about a stubborn old ox named Jeremiah, who refused to pull a sled if the sun wasn't shining, and about a young logger from back east who was so homesick he tried to flavor his beans with pine needles. As he spoke, his voice low and steady, June found herself listening, picturing the world he described. And one evening, as he recounted a story of a clumsy bear cub that had fallen into their empty cookpot, the corner of June's mouth twitched upwards in an involuntary, fleeting smile. It was a ghost of a thing, there and gone in a heartbeat, and she immediately ducked her head, her face burning with a sudden, inexplicable shame, as if she had betrayed some solemn vow of misery. But Wyatt saw it. He didn't comment, but a warmth softened his eyes, and he fell silent, letting the moment settle between them. Yet, for every small step forward, there was a barrier she could not overcome. It was a wall of her own making, built of memory and shame. Whenever Wyatt came close, a cold panic seized her. One afternoon, he was helping her hoist a heavy sack of oats into the feed bin. As they lifted it together, his hand brushed against hers. It was nothing, a moment of incidental contact, but for June, it was a brand of fire. She flinched back as if she'd been stung, dropping her side of the sack. Oats spilled across the floor in a pale, dusty cascade. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her face white, her voice trembling. She couldn't look at him. She stared at the spilled grain, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening rhythm. The memory of another man's touch, a touch that was not accidental, a touch that was heavy with ownership, flooded her senses. Wyatt didn't say a word. He didn't ask her what was wrong. He didn't try to comfort her. He simply stood still for a long second, giving her space. Then he bent down, found the small broom in the corner, and handed it to her, carefully placing it in her hand without touching her skin again. "It's just oats," he said, his voice calm and even. "No harm done." The incident repeated itself in smaller ways. He would hand her a mug of coffee, and she would take it so carefully, her fingers skirting his, terrified of another accidental touch. He would reach for the awl she was using, and she would place it on the workbench between them rather than pass it to him directly. Each time it happened, she hated herself for it. She wasn't afraid of him. In the quiet, rational corners of her mind, she knew Wyatt Hale was a good man. His hands were gentle with his horses and steady in their work. His gaze was respectful. His presence was a comfort. But the poison of her past ran too deep. It was a voice that whispered to her in the dead of night, a voice that insisted she was tainted, spoiled. She felt that her very skin was a record of her shame, and that to allow a good man to touch her would be to stain him with her own unworthiness. It was not him she recoiled from, but the ugliness she was convinced he would feel if he ever truly touched her. To be touched by him felt like a lie, a pretense that she was a whole and clean person, deserving of such simple, human contact. And so she flinched, again and again, pushing away the one thing she was beginning to secretly, desperately want. The days grew shorter, the sun a brief, apologetic visitor in the sky. The snow returned, not in a furious blizzard, but as a quiet, persistent guest. It fell for days on end, a thick, soft curtain that muffled the world and deepened the sense of isolation. The mail sleigh, the only regular link to Bridle Pass, was often delayed, and the way station became an island in a vast, white sea. It was on one such evening, with the snow falling in heavy, silent flakes past the windows and the wind murmuring in the chimney, that Wyatt Hale arrived. It was late, well past dark. Supper had been eaten, the dishes cleaned and put away. Mabel was knitting by the fire, her needles clicking with a steady, metronomic rhythm. June was mending a horse blanket, her stitches small and even in the warm lamplight. A sudden, heavy knock on the door made them both look up. It wasn't the tentative rap of a lost traveler. It was solid, urgent. Mabel set her knitting aside and went to the door, June rising behind her, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. When the door was unbolted and pulled open, Wyatt Hale stood on the porch, a figure of snow and shadow. He was covered in it, his hat and the broad shoulders of his coat heavy with a thick white layer. He looked utterly spent, his face pale with exhaustion beneath its weathered tan. "Wyatt," Mabel said, her voice sharp with surprise but not alarm. "Bit late for a social call." "Had trouble on the trail," he said, his voice rough. He stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air and the clean scent of snow with him. As he shrugged off his heavy coat, June saw the reason for his late arrival. The sleeve of his woolen shirt was dark and stiff with blood, and a soiled rag was wrapped clumsily around his left hand. June's breath caught. She moved forward without thinking, her mending forgotten. "You're hurt." He glanced down at his hand as if just remembering it. "Pine branch. Had a disagreement with me on the North Ridge? It won." He tried for a casual tone, but a line of pain was etched beside his mouth. He began to fumble with the knot on the rag with his good hand. "Here, you fool. Sit down before you bleed all over my clean floor," Mabel grumbled, though she was already moving toward the medicine box. "June, fetch the warm water." June was already on her way. Her fear was gone, replaced by the familiar, calming focus that came with tending to a wound. She brought a basin of steaming water, a bar of lye soap, and clean cotton cloths to the long plank table. Wyatt was seated on the bench, his back to the fire. In the combined light of the lamp and the flickering flames, his face looked carved from stone. He had managed to get the rag off. The cut was deep, a clean, diagonal slash across his palm and the fleshy heel of his hand. It was still oozing blood, dark and sluggish in the cold. "It needs to be cleaned well," June said, her voice quiet but steady. She looked at him, waiting for permission. He met her gaze, his amber eyes dark with pain but clear and trusting. He gave a single, slow nod and held his hand out over the basin. This was the moment she always dreaded. The touch. But now, there was no choice. Her duty to care for the wound was stronger than her fear. She took a deep breath and gently took his hand in hers to lower it into the warm water. His hand was large and heavy, the skin rough and calloused from years of work. It was surprisingly warm. As she began to clean the wound, her small, trembling fingers moving carefully over his skin. A strange current passed through her. She was holding his hand, not for a fleeting, accidental second, but for a long, sustained minute. Then another. He didn't move a muscle, his hand resting trustingly in hers. She could feel the steady, slow pulse in his wrist beneath her thumb. It was a living, solid presence. The memory of that other touch, the one she fought against daily, tried to surface. The memory of a soft, clammy hand that had felt like a cage, a hand that took without asking. She felt a familiar tremor of revulsion, but she forced it down. This was different. This was not a hand that was taking something from her. It was a hand that was hurt, a hand that was being offered to her for healing. For the first time, she was the one with the power in the touch, the power to soothe, to clean, to mend. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. She cleaned every trace of dirt and pine needles from the gash, her movements becoming more confident as the moment stretched on. Wyatt watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't wince or pull back, even when she had to press firmly. He just sat there, solid and still, and let her work. Mabel brought a bottle of whiskey, pouring a generous amount onto a clean cloth. "This will sting," June warned him softly. "I reckon it will," he replied, his voice a low rumble. She pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the wound. He drew a sharp breath through his teeth, his whole body tensing, but his hand remained steady in hers. When the worst of the stinging had passed, she patted it dry and reached for the tin of salve. She had to hold his palm open, spreading the ointment carefully into the cut with her fingertip. The contact was intimate, deliberate, and still, he let her. Finally, she took a long strip of clean cotton and began to wrap the bandage around his palm, over the back of his hand, between his thumb and forefinger, her hands moving with a sureness that surprised her. When she was done, she tied the knot and her work was finished. The entire process had taken nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes of sustained, necessary contact. She let go of his hand, her own falling to her lap. She felt strangely lightheaded, her heart beating a fast, unsteady rhythm. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. She stared at her own hands, at the traces of his blood beneath her fingernails. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the soft moan of the wind outside. Mabel, seeing the task was done, had discreetly moved to the other side of the room to stir the embers in the hearth. "June." Wyatt's voice was quiet, but it commanded her attention. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head and met his eyes. He hadn't moved. His newly bandaged hand lay on the table, starkly white against the dark wood. He was looking at her not with gratitude, but with an unnerving, gentle intensity. "I see the fear in your eyes," he said, his voice low and even. "Meant only for her. Every time I get close, I see you pull away." June froze, her blood turning to ice. This was it. He was going to ask. He was going to demand the explanation she could never give. The shame rose in her throat like bile. But he didn't ask. He continued to hold her gaze. His own unwavering, "I haven't asked why. Because I'm waiting for the day you want to tell me." He paused, letting the words sink into the quiet space between them. "And if that day never comes," he said, his voice dropping even lower, softer, "I'm still here." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only stare at him, her own gray eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. No one had ever said anything like that to her. People either ignored her pain or demanded to know its source, as if her story was a debt they were owed. The man from her past had used her vulnerability as a leash, a way to keep her bound to him through a twisted sense of gratitude. Everyone had always wanted something from her, her work, her body, her story. Wyatt wanted nothing. He was simply offering his presence, unconditional and patient. He saw her brokenness, and he did not demand that she fix it for his comfort. He was giving her something she didn't even know she was allowed to have: the right to her own silence, the right to her own pain, the right to heal, or not heal, on her own terms. She was speechless. There were no words for the immense, shattering relief that washed over her. It was a feeling so profound, so terrifyingly new, that it left her hollowed out. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away with the back of her hand. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. It was all she could manage. It was all she needed. He seemed to understand. He held her gaze for another long moment. And then he gave her that quiet, familiar nod in return. The bargain was sealed. The truth had been spoken. Not the truth of her past, but a new and more powerful truth that she was seen. She was accepted, and she was not alone. Wyatt's words had been a key turning a lock deep inside June. They had not opened the door. She was not ready for that, but they had let in a sliver of light, a possibility that the dark room of her past was not a life sentence. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The terror that had lived in her bones for so long did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. She still flinched from an accidental touch, but the self-loathing that followed was less acute, tempered now by the memory of his patient eyes and his promise, "I'm still here." The high country began to stir from its winter slumber. The iron grip of the frost relaxed, and the days grew longer, the light softer. Water began to drip from the eaves, a slow, steady rhythm that was the heartbeat of the coming thaw. With the melting snow came more frequent travel on the road. The mail sleigh, driven by a grizzled old-timer named Jedediah, became a weekly fixture once more. Trappers, their winter's haul of pelts bundled on pack mules, began to make their way down from the mountains. And with the people came the talk. Bridle Pass was a small town, and its primary currency was gossip. A secret could not long survive in its thin, cold air. Jedediah, who often stayed for a hot meal, was a keen observer. He saw the way Wyatt Hale's horse was tied to the hitching post outside the way station at least once a week. He saw the foreman himself, sitting at Mabel's table, drinking coffee as if he belonged there. More than that, he saw the small, almost invisible things, the way the quiet, gray-eyed girl's hand stilled in her mending when Wyatt spoke, the way Wyatt's gaze would follow her as she moved about the room. Jedediah meant no harm, but in the idle chatter at the general store, these small observations were planted like seeds in fertile ground. "Seems old Mabel's got herself a permanent boarder up there," he'd mentioned to Mr. Gable, the storekeeper. Not Mabel. Another man would chime in, leaning on the counter. "It's the girl. Hale ain't riding 10 miles through slush and mud for Mabel Clay's conversation." From there, the story grew a life of its own, twisting and turning in the retelling. In the minds of the townspeople, the quiet way station became a place of illicit meetings. June, the girl with no past and no name, became a woman of questionable character. Her silence was mistaken for slyness, her solitude for shame. June was blissfully unaware of this at first, sheltered in her routine, but the day came when the flour bin was empty and the salt crock was low. Mabel, counting out coins onto the table, looked at June. "The road is clear enough? Time for a supply run," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. A cold dread, a feeling she had not felt so sharply in months, washed over June. Go into town, face the people, the stares, the questions she saw in their eyes. The sanctuary of the way station had been so complete that she had forgotten what it felt like to be exposed. The old instinct screamed at her to make an excuse, to feign illness, but then she saw Wyatt's face in her mind, his steady, amber gaze. "I'm still here." She was not the same girl who had stumbled off that train, hunched against the wind and the world. She took the coins and the list. "I'll get my coat," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. The walk into Bridle Pass was a descent into a world she had tried to forget. The sun was bright on the wet, muddy road, but it offered no warmth against the chill of her anxiety. As she entered the town's single street, she felt the change immediately. Before, she had been met with curiosity. Now, she was met with judgment. The first blow came from a group of women, the wives of the town's more prosperous men, gathered outside the dressmaker's shop. As June approached, their lively chatter fell silent. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on her, their gazes as sharp and cold as ice picks. They took in her simple, homemade dress, her worn boots, and the quiet set of her face. As she passed, a whisper, sharp and venomous as a snake's hiss, reached her ears. Asterisk brazen is what it is. Asterisk. The word struck her, and for a moment, the old shame burned in her cheeks. Her first instinct was to lower her head, to hurry past, to make herself invisible. But she didn't. She lifted her chin a fraction of an inch higher, kept her eyes fixed on the door of the general store, and walked on, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and unspoken accusations. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, who had once been politely indifferent, was now coolly efficient. She filled June's order without a single pleasantry, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. June felt the eyes of the other customers on her, felt their whispers follow her down the aisle. She paid for her goods, her hand steady as she counted out the coins, and walked back out into the harsh sunlight, her basket heavy in her arms. The final trial waited for her. A group of men were loitering on the boardwalk outside the saloon, their shoulders slumped in afternoon idleness. They watched her approach, their eyes crawling over her with a lazy, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. This was a look she knew. It was the look of a man weighing and measuring a piece of property. As she drew level with them, one of them, a burly man named Silas with a tangle of a beard and small, piggish eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Well now," he drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it ain't the little winter bird from up the hill, heard the foreman's keeping your nest warm these days." The other men snickered. The words were a physical blow, crude and ugly. They were designed to strip her of her dignity, to reduce her to a thing. The world tilted, and for a horrible second, she was back in that dim, perfumed room, the weight of a man's satisfied gaze pressing down on her, suffocating her. Asterisk, you have been spent. You are not worthy. Her breath hitched. Her hands, clutching the handle of the basket, went white at the knuckles. She was going to break. The shame was a tide, rising to pull her under. She could feel her shoulders starting to hunch, her head starting to bow. But then, through the roaring in her ears, another voice cut through, a quiet, steady voice from a snowy night. Asterisk, and if that day never comes, I'm still here. Wyatt's promise was an anchor in the storm of her panic. He had seen the fear in her, the part of her she thought was the most shameful, and he had not turned away. He had accepted her. His acceptance was a shield. What did the opinion of these men matter, when a man like him had already seen her truth and offered her his unwavering presence? Slowly, deliberately, June stopped walking. She turned her head and looked directly at Silas. She did not speak. She did not glare. She simply met his gaze with her own. Her gray eyes, clear and cold as a winter sky, held no fear and no shame. They held nothing but a profound, unnerving stillness. She looked at him not as a victim, but as an equal, and her silence was an accusation. It asked a question he could not answer, asterisk. "Why are you so small, asterisk?" The man's smirk faltered. He was prepared for tears or a frightened retreat. He was not prepared for this quiet, unyielding composure. The other men's laughter died in their throats, under her steady gaze. Silas shifted his weight, his eyes darting away. He cleared his throat and spat again, but the gesture was hollow now. He looked away first. June held his gaze for another second. Then she turned her back on him and continued her walk down the street, her footsteps even and unhurried. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her head was held high. When she returned to the way station, the silence and safety of the place washed over her like a balm. Mabel was sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic asterisk, shing, 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 asterisk, a comforting sound. She glanced up as June approached, her sharp eyes missing nothing, not the slight tremor in June's hands, nor the new, resolute set of her jaw. The town dogs were barking. Were they, Mabel said, not even pausing in her work? June just nodded, setting her basket down. She didn't need to explain. Mabel tested the edge of the blade with her thumb, then looked out toward the distant, hazy mountains. A thin, cynical smile touched her lips. "Don't you pay them any mind," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "They're not mad at you for what they think you've done." She looked at June then, her pale blue eyes holding a spark of fierce, unpitying wisdom. "They're scared of you because you're living, not because you're wrong." The words settled into June's soul, finding the cracks Wyatt's promise had made and widening them. Scared of her, not because she was soiled or broken, but because she was surviving, because she had walked into their town with nothing but a quiet determination to exist, and in their small, fearful world, A woman living on her own terms was a more frightening thing than any imagined sin. For the first time, June saw their scorn not as a reflection of her own worthlessness, but of their own limitations. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that she would not be bowing her head again. The false spring of the thaw had settled over the high country, a time of deceptive peace. The snow receded, exposing the damp, dark earth, and the air carried the scent of wet pine and melting ice. The nights were still cold, but they had lost their brutal, unforgiving edge. A silver-dollar moon hung in a sky of deep indigo, casting long, skeletal shadows from the bare cottonwood trees. It was in this quiet that the sound came. It was not the sharp bark of a fox or the hoot of an owl. It was a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the air, a note of primal hunger that the land itself seemed to recognize and fear. It was a wolf. The horses heard it first. A nervous shuffle rippled through the stable, followed by a low, uneasy whinny. June was in her small room, patching a tear in her dress by the light of a single candle. She paused, her needle in midair, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, and was answered by another from a different direction. A pack. Then the stable erupted. It was not a sound of simple fear. It was a symphony of pure, animal terror. The heavy thud of hooves crashing against stall doors. The high, piercing scream of a horse in mortal panic. It was the sound of trapped, powerful creatures convinced they were about to die. June was out of her room in an instant, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The lantern in the main stable aisle was swinging wildly, casting chaotic, dancing shadows. The 6 sleigh horses were crazed, their eyes rolling white, their bodies slick with sweat. In the main house, a light flared as Mabel lit a lamp. A moment later, she appeared at the stable door, a heavy Winchester rifle held expertly in her hands. Wyatt was there, too. He'd ridden in that afternoon with a broken harness and stayed for supper, delayed by a lame horse. He was already moving down the aisle, his voice a low, steady rumble, trying to cut through the panic. "Easy now, easy, boys, settle down." But the horses were beyond reason. The scent of the wolves, carried on the night air, had driven them mad. One of the larger geldings reared up, its front hooves striking the top of its stall door with a splintering crack. June felt a paralysis of terror. The raw, uncontrollable fear of the horses was a mirror, reflecting a feeling she kept locked away so deep inside herself. The feeling of being trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a predator. The barn, which had always been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage full of thrashing, broken things. The howling outside rose to a fever pitch, a chorus of wild, hungry voices that seemed to be right outside the walls. Wyatt worked his way to the main door, unbarring it just enough to peer out into the darkness. "They're at the edge of the trees," he called back, his voice tight. "A big pack. They smell the horses." Mabel lifted the rifle. "They're bold. The long winter has made them hungry." She moved to the door beside Wyatt, her face grim and set. One shot should be enough to spook them. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, took aim into the darkness above the trees, and fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The smell of gunpowder instantly filled the air. The horses screamed and crashed against the wood, but outside, the howling stopped abruptly. After a long, tense moment of silence, Mabel nodded. "That'll send them running for a while." She and Wyatt barred the heavy door. The immediate danger passed, but the aftermath of the terror remained. The horses were still trembling, their breathing coming in great, shuddering gasps. It took the better part of an hour to calm them. Wyatt and June moving from stall to stall, speaking in low, soothing tones, checking for injuries. Mabel, her part in the drama finished, had gone back to the house, leaving them to their work. June was stroking the neck of a young mare, her hands moving in long, calming strokes. The mare's skin was hot and damp, and a fine tremor ran through her entire body. "It's all right," June whispered, her voice thick. "You're safe now. It's over. You're safe." She was speaking to the horse, but the words were for herself. She was repeating the lie she told herself every single day. But tonight, the lie had broken. The raw, violent fear of the past few minutes had shattered the fragile shell of her composure. The control she exerted over herself, the constant, exhausting effort of holding everything in, had snapped. A tremor started in her own hands, mirroring the horse's. A sound, small and strangled, escaped her throat. Her vision blurred. She pressed her forehead against the mare's warm, sweaty neck, hoping the physical contact could ground her, could hold her together, but it was no use. A sob tore its way out of her chest, a ragged, ugly sound of something breaking. Then another. The tears she had refused to shed for so long came in a hot, unstoppable flood. They were not gentle tears of sadness. They were violent, wrenching sobs of pure, undiluted grief and terror. She sank to her knees in the clean straw, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands, utterly consumed by the storm she had kept locked inside for so long. She was vaguely aware of Wyatt's presence, of the soft crunch of his boots in the straw as he approached. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, steady shadow in the lantern light. She wanted him to go away. She wanted to be left alone with her shame, to shatter into a million pieces in the dark where no one could see. The wave of weeping finally subsided, leaving her empty and trembling, gasping for breath. She still knelt in the straw, unable to move, unable to look up. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice quiet from somewhere above her. She shook her head, her face still hidden. "I thought," she began, her words broken by shudders. "I thought if I held everything inside, if I just didn't let anything out, I could control it, control the pain." She took a ragged breath. "It was the only thing I had, the holding on, like holding my breath underwater. I thought if I just held on tight enough, it couldn't break me again." The confession hung in the quiet air of the stable, raw and exposed. It was the truest thing she had ever said aloud. She heard him take a step closer. She braced herself for a kind, pitying word, for a clumsy pat on the shoulder, for something that would make her feel even more fragile and exposed. Instead, she felt a gentle but firm pressure under her chin. Two of his fingers, calloused and rough from work, were tilting her head up, forcing her to look at him. His face was serious in the warm lantern light, his amber eyes holding an ocean of understanding. There was no pity in them, only a profound, steady strength. He was not looking at a broken thing. He was looking at her. "You've been holding on for a long time." "June," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He did not take his fingers from her chin. "You held on because you had to." He paused, letting her feel the truth of those words. He was not judging her weakness. He was acknowledging her strength. "But you can let go now," he continued softly. "Let me hold some of it for a while. Just a little." He looked directly into her tear-filled eyes, his gaze a solid anchor in her swirling chaos. "You won't fall," he promised. "I've got you." His words hung in the quiet, lantern-lit air of the stable, a promise so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. "I've got you." June felt them not just in her ears, but deep in her bones, a warmth spreading through the chill of her breakdown. He didn't rush her. He simply stood there, a solid presence in the straw-scented darkness, until the last of her shudders subsided and she was able to find her feet. He walked her back to the main house, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It was a simple, grounding touch, a silent continuation of his promise, and for the first time, she did not flinch. She did not recoil. She leaned into it, just a fraction, allowing his strength to steady her. This small, silent surrender was a bigger step than any she had ever taken. Mabel was sitting at the table, a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the stove. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes taking in June's tear-stained face and the quiet way Wyatt stood beside her. She read the entire story in that single, silent glance. She was a woman who had no time for sentiment, but she understood survival. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "There's a fire laid in the hearth," she said, her voice its usual gravelly tone. "Needs a match. I'm turning in." It was not a dismissal, but a gift of privacy, of space. She was ceding the heart of her home to them for the night. Without another word, the old woman took a lamp and disappeared into her room, closing the door softly behind her. They were left alone in the large, quiet room. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the coffee pot and the mournful sigh of the wind outside. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the raw, exposed truth of June's confession in the barn. She felt fragile, as if her skin were made of glass. But the terror was gone, replaced by a vast, quiet emptiness. Wyatt moved to the fireplace and struck a match. The kindling caught, and the flames began to lick at the seasoned logs, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her, his fingers carefully avoiding hers. He was still giving her that space, still letting her set the terms. They sat on the rough-hewn bench before the fire, not speaking. The silence was not awkward. It was a comfortable, healing thing. June stared into the flames, watching the wood turn from black to glowing red. She felt his presence beside her, solid and calm. He was not looking at her, but she could feel his attention, a gentle warmth that asked for nothing. After a long time, he set his mug down on the stone hearth. He turned to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took her hand. His touch was a question. June's breath caught. Her gaze dropped to their joined hands. His was large, brown, and crisscrossed with the scars of his work. Hers was small and pale, trembling slightly within his. The old, familiar instinct to pull away, to hide, flickered inside her. The ghost of another man's hand, soft and possessive, rose in her memory. But this was different. Wyatt's hand was not a cage. It was an anchor. It did not take, it offered. It did not demand. It invited. She looked from their hands to his face. His amber eyes were soft in the firelight, and in them, she saw no desire for conquest, no pity for a broken thing. She saw only a quiet, patient man who had offered to help her carry a burden that was not his. Slowly, she curled her fingers around his. It was an answer. The warmth of his skin seemed to travel up her arm, chasing away the last of the deep, internal chill. He did not move, did not press his advantage. He simply held her hand, letting her grow accustomed to the feeling, to the reality of this shared, consensual touch. This was not something happening asterisk to asterisk her. It was something she was a part of. The world seemed to slow down, shrinking to the space between them. Lit by the dancing flames, he raised her hand and gently brushed his lips against her knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of a reverence she had never known, that it made her ache. He was not touching a body. He was acknowledging a person. He moved closer, and she did not retreat. He raised his other hand to her face, his calloused thumb gently stroking her cheek, wiping away the dried track of a tear. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. For the first time, there was no fear. There was no cold knot of dread in her stomach, no voice whispering that she was unclean and unworthy. There was only the solid, reassuring presence of this man and the overwhelming feeling of being safe. This was her first night, the real one. It was not a whirlwind of passion, nor a clumsy, hurried transaction in a darkened room. It was a slow, quiet discovery. It was imperfect and hesitant, a moment of awkwardness when his bandaged hand brushed her side, a shared, soft laugh when a log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. It was real. He was not an aggressor, but a guide. He learned the map of her sorrow not with words, but with a patient, gentle touch. He moved with a slowness that gave her time to breathe, to think, to feel. Every touch was a question, and he waited for her silent answer before proceeding. He did not demand or expect anything from her. She did not have to perform or pretend to be someone she was not. They were simply two people, together in the firelight, and the quiet space between them was filled not with demands, but with a profound and healing grace. He showed her that a man's touch could be a shelter, not a threat, and she, in her silent, trembling trust, let him see the quiet, broken places she had kept hidden from the world, and from herself. It was a conversation held in the language of slow breaths and gentle hands, a mending of something she had thought was shattered beyond repair. Later, they lay together on a thick bearskin rug before the dying fire, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The room was dark now, save for the soft, pulsing glow of the embers. June was nestled against his side, her head on his shoulder. His arm was a warm, solid weight around her, holding her close. The house was silent. The world was asleep. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly, and bone-deeply safe. She was not the same girl who had run from her reflection, who had flinched from a kind hand. She was not whole, not yet. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined her. She stirred, lifting her head slightly to look at his face, a strong silhouette in the soft red glow. He was awake, his eyes open, watching her. A thought, clear and true, rose from the deepest part of her. She had to give it voice. "The first time," she whispered, her voice barely a sound in the stillness. "It was like something was stolen from me." He listened, his expression unchanging, giving her the space to find her words. "But tonight," she said, her voice growing a little stronger, filled with a sense of wonder and discovery. "Tonight, it feels like I just got it back." A gentle softness filled his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. The gesture was an answer, an affirmation, an entire conversation without a single word. It said, "Asterisk. I understand. It was always yours, and you are safe here." She laid her head back down on his shoulder, a profound peace settling over her. And as the last embers of the fire faded to gray, June Calder closed her eyes and fell asleep in a man's arms. And for the first time, she was not afraid. The thaw was a liar. It whispered promises of spring in the drip of melting icicles and the smell of damp earth. But its heart was still winter. The rivers and creeks, unlocked from their deep freeze, became treacherous. The ice didn't melt evenly. It rotted from beneath, becoming a fragile, gray crust over the churning, frigid water. It was a dangerous time, a time for caution. But the work of the logging camp had its own relentless schedule. Wyatt Hale was a careful man, not a reckless one, but he was also a foreman with a deadline. They had one last load of prime timber to haul across the Ghost River before the ice became completely impassable. He'd waited for a clear, cold morning, when a night-long frost had firmed up the surface. It was a calculated risk, one he had taken in seasons past. But the thaw, this year, was more fickle. The news came to the way station in the form of a boy on a half-dead horse. He was one of Wyatt's youngest loggers, a teenager named Billy, and he burst into the main room without knocking, his face a mask of terror and frozen tears. Snow was falling again, a sudden, vicious squall that had blown in from the north, reducing visibility to a few yards. "It's Mr. Hale!" the boy gasped, his words tumbling out between ragged, desperate breaths. He was clutching his side, exhausted from his frantic ride. The river, the ice. It broke up under the sleigh. Mabel was on her feet instantly, her face a hard, grim line. "Is he—" "He's pinned," Billy cried, his voice breaking. The big lead log rolled when the sleigh went over. "It's got his leg trapped under the water. We can't move it. We tried, but the ice keeps breaking away." He's been in the water for nearly half an hour. The world seemed to stop. The quiet, warm room with its crackling fire and the smell of coffee became a distant, unreal place. Half an hour in that water. June knew what that meant. A man could freeze to death in minutes. A cold, sharp dread, more piercing than any fear she had ever felt for herself, seized her. While Mabel and Billy were still speaking, while the boy was still trying to catch his breath and explain, June was already moving. There was no thought, no hesitation. The old, timid girl who weighed every action, who measured every word, was gone. In her place was a woman propelled by a single, desperate imperative. Asterisk Wyatt. Asterisk. She didn't grab her thin wool coat. She ran to the peg by the door where Wyatt's heavy, sheepskin-lined coat still hung from his last visit and shrugged it on. Its weight and his lingering scent of pine and cold air were a strange, immediate comfort. From the barn. She took not a lantern, but a coil of thick rope and a woodsman's axe, its blade honed to a razor's edge. She didn't saddle a horse. The drifts were becoming too deep for speed. She would be faster on foot, following the sleigh tracks. June Mabel called out as she burst from the barn. "Axe in hand. Wait for the men from town. Billy's going to fetch them." But June didn't even turn. She couldn't wait. The town was a mile in the other direction. The men would take time to gather. Time was a luxury Wyatt didn't have. She plunged into the swirling snow, her head down against the wind, her legs pumping, her lungs already beginning to burn from the icy air. The world was a blinding chaos of white. The wind shrieked, tearing at her, trying to push her back. Snow stung her eyes and clogged her throat. But she kept on, her mind a blank slate save for the image of his face, his amber eyes, his quiet, steady smile. "I'm still here." The promise he had made to her was now a promise she was making to him. She found the scene of the accident a mile up the trail, a place of horrific, frozen violence. The sleigh was half submerged, tilted at a grotesque angle in a ragged hole of black. Churning water. The two draft horses, magnificent beasts, had been cut loose by the loggers and stood shivering on the bank, their coats caked with ice. 3 of Wyatt's men were there, huddled and helpless, their faces numb with shock and cold. And then she saw him. He was in the water, his body limp, his head and shoulders propped against the edge of the solid ice, a massive, dark log, slick with water, lay across his left leg, pinning him beneath the surface. His face was a ghastly, bloodless white, his lips blue, his eyes were closed. For a terrible, heart-stopping moment, she thought she was too late. "We can't move it," one of the men yelled at her over the wind. "Every time we get close, more ice breaks off." June didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze was fixed on Wyatt. She dropped the axe and the rope and scrambled to the edge of the hole, the rotten ice groaning under her weight. She lay flat on her stomach to distribute her weight and reached for him. "Wyatt," she screamed, her voice raw. "Wyatt, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. He looked at her, but his eyes were unfocused, clouded with the cold that was stealing his life. She looked at the log. It was immense, waterlogged, impossibly heavy. The men were right. 3 of them hadn't been able to budge it. She looked at Wyatt, at the way the current was pulling at his body. She had to work fast. Her mind, sharpened by desperation, saw not an obstacle, but a problem of leverage. She grabbed the coil of rope, working with numb, clumsy fingers. She tied a bowline knot, a knot she had learned from him, a knot that would not slip. She crawled back to the edge, the other men watching her as if she were a madwoman. "I need to get this under the log, near his legs," she shouted. The youngest of the men, his face pale, understood. He lay on his stomach beside her, and together, plunging their arms into the paralyzing water. They managed to work the loop of rope under the end of the massive log. The cold was an agony, a fire that burned all the way to the bone. She scrambled back, pulling the rope with her. She looked around, her eyes scanning the riverbank. There! A thick, sturdy cottonwood tree stood about 20 feet back from the edge. She ran the rope around the base of the tree, creating a crude but effective pulley. "What are you doing?" one of the men asked, bewildered. "Pulling," she yelled back, grabbing the end of the rope. "Pull from this angle. Not straight up. Pull it sideways." She wrapped the rope around her hands and pulled. The rope went taut, vibrating with tension. The log didn't move. It was like trying to pull a mountain. She dug her heels into the snow and leaned back, throwing every ounce of her being into the effort. Her muscles screamed. The rough rope cut into her gloved hands. The world narrowed to the rope, the tree, and the impossible weight at the other end. "Help her!" the young logger yelled, and the other two men, shaken from their stupor, joined her on the rope. Together June gasped. On 3, 1, 2, 3. They threw their combined weight against the rope. There was a great, groaning crack as the log shifted, scraping against the ice. It moved only an inch, but it was enough. Again she cried, her voice cracking. They pulled again, and this time, the log slid sideways, dragging through the water and mud, moving just enough to free him. Wyatt's body floated limply in the dark water. Without a second's hesitation, June dropped the rope and threw herself back onto the ice at the edge of the hole. She grabbed the front of his heavy coat and pulled. He was a dead weight, saturated with water. She got his shoulders onto the ice, but she couldn't pull him further. At that moment, the men from Bridle Pass arrived, a small posse led by Jedediah and the blacksmith. They saw the scene: the overturned sleigh, the stunned loggers, and the small, determined woman on her stomach, her hands tangled in the coat of the half-submerged foreman, refusing to let go. They stared at her. This was not the timid, silent girl from the way station. This was not the object of their gossip. This was a force of nature, her face set in a mask of fierce determination, her small frame radiating a strength that defied belief. The men rushed forward, pulling Wyatt from the water and onto the solid bank. They wrapped him in dry blankets they had brought, trying to force warm brandy between his blue lips. June knelt beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. She pushed the wet hair back from his forehead, her touch desperate. His skin was terrifyingly cold. His eyes fluttered open again. This time, they were clear. They focused on her face, ignoring the crowd of men who now surrounded them. He saw her, her face streaked with tears and snow, her hands raw and bleeding from the rope, her eyes wild with a fierce, protective love. A flicker of a smile touched his frozen lips. He tried to speak, his voice a faint, hoarse whisper, lost in the wind. She leaned closer, putting her ear to his mouth, needing to hear. "I knew," he breathed, the words a ghost of a sound. "I knew you would come." Wyatt's recovery was slow, a testament to how close the river had come to claiming him. For 2 weeks, he lay weak and feverish in the way station's main room, tended to by June and Mabel. The town that had whispered about June now spoke of her in hushed, awestruck tones. The men who had been there, on the riverbank, told the story of the quiet girl who had charged into a blizzard with an axe and a rope, her will a force stronger than any of them had ever witnessed. When people from Bridle Pass brought gifts of broth or bread, their eyes, when they looked at June, were filled with a new and profound respect. She met their gazes steadily, accepting their offerings with a quiet grace, but their opinions no longer held the power to define her. Spring finally arrived in truth, a gentle, insistent green that pushed up through the last patches of snow. The Ghost River, which had nearly been Wyatt's grave, was now a murmuring, peaceful ribbon of blue, its banks lined with new willow shoots. The air was soft, filled with the scent of thawing earth and the cheerful sound of bird song. With the change in seasons came a change in the very soul of the way station, A quiet, unspoken peace had settled within its walls. Wyatt, now fully recovered though, with a permanent limp that would always favor his left leg, was a constant presence. He was still the foreman of the Oxbow camp, but he spent more nights at the way station than he did in his own bunkhouse. His relationship with June was a thing of quiet, established fact, as natural and understood as the sunrise. It was a partnership built not on grand declarations, but on the shared language of a held hand, a knowing glance across a room, a comfortable silence by a crackling fire. One bright morning, June walked into the main room to find Mabel engaged in an unusual activity. She was vigorously polishing an old, forgotten silver teapot that had sat tarnished on a high shelf for as long as June had been there. She rubbed at it with a soft cloth, her movements brisk and purposeful. June watched her for a moment. "That's a beautiful pot," she said softly. Mabel didn't look up from her work. She held the teapot to the light, inspecting a stubborn dark spot. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice a low grumble. "Useless thing. Really, too fancy for this place." She gave it one last, hard rub and set it on the table, where it gleamed in a dusty sunbeam. "Still," she continued, speaking to the pot and not to June, "it makes a decent cup of tea." She paused, her back still to June. "The Oxbow camp will be moving further north come summer. Once the upper passes are clear, a man with a bad leg will need a good roof over his head up there. A permanent one." She finally turned, her pale blue eyes meeting June's. There was no softness in them, but there was an unmistakable finality. "If you two are planning on heading up that way," she said, her voice as dry as dust, "you might as well take this teapot with you. No sense in it collecting dust here for another 20 years. The words were as close to a blessing as Mabel Clay would ever come. It was her gruff, practical way of acknowledging what was to come, of giving her permission, of letting go. A lump formed in June's throat. She couldn't speak, so she simply nodded, her heart full. The girl who had arrived in Bridle Pass 6 months earlier would have been terrified by the prospect of such a future. But the woman June had become was not afraid. Later that day, as she was filling a water bucket by the trough, she caught her reflection in the still, clear surface. She paused, looking at the image. The face that stared back was familiar, yet changed. The hair was still the color of damp soil, the eyes still gray as a storm cloud, but the fear was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, a calm self-possession. The lines of her mouth were softer, no longer held in a tight, defensive line. Her hands, gripping the bucket, were calloused and capable. This was her face. This was her body. It was a record not of shame, but of survival. For the first time, she looked at her own reflection and felt not a stranger's judgment, but a friend's recognition. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and the woman in the water smiled back. To celebrate the true arrival of spring and Wyatt's full recovery, they had a small gathering by the creek. It wasn't a town party, but a small collection of the people who mattered Mabel, Jedediah the mail driver, and a few of Wyatt's most loyal loggers. A great bonfire crackled, sending sparks dancing up into the twilight. Someone played a cheerful, slightly off-key tune on a fiddle. June wore a new dress. She had made it herself from 3 bolts of soft green cotton she had bought in town. The color was the shade of new leaves, a promise of life and new beginnings. She had sewn it in the quiet evenings in her small room, the act of creation a final, healing stitch in the fabric of her own soul. She stood beside Wyatt, her hand held firmly and comfortably in his, watching the firelight flicker on the faces of their friends. She felt a sense of belonging so profound it was almost overwhelming. She was not an outsider here, not a curiosity. She was a part of this small, rugged family, bound together by the shared hardships of a Wyoming winter. As the sky deepened from lavender to a dark, velvety purple, one of the loggers, in a fit of celebration, lit a string of fireworks he'd been saving since Christmas. They shot into the air with a fizz and a bang, exploding in brilliant, fleeting showers of red and gold against the vast, starry canvas. Everyone cheered, their face turned to the sky, in the beautiful, chaotic light of the explosions. Wyatt turned his head and looked at June. He didn't speak loudly to be heard over the noise. He leaned in close, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her. "You're not anyone else. June," he said, his amber eyes reflecting the fire and the bursting light. "You're you." He paused, his gaze holding hers, seeing all the way to the bottom of her, to the places that were still tender, still healing. "And you don't have to hold on so tight anymore," he whispered, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I'm here, whether you let go or hold on." His words were the final, quiet echo of the promise that had saved her. She didn't need to hold her breath anymore. She didn't need to brace for a fall. She could simply be. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a deep, quiet, and overwhelming joy. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder as another firework painted the night sky in brilliant, impossible color, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely and utterly free. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.